Hey everyone, we've got a very interesting topic today. We're going to be talking about nihilism. Now, there's a number of different definitions for nihilism. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as I'm talking here. But essentially, nihilism comes down to a view that causes psychological distress because of how existence is perceived. So let me go ahead and switch here to my Outlook, and then we can look at that too. All right, hopefully you all can see that okay. I think you can. Actually, let me try switching just to the screen there. But anyways, I'll keep talking here as I'm going. Nihilism, this is a famous picture if anyone's seen it before. It's kind of like the existential dread that people might feel when they really start to question their own existence. I'm sure we've all had that in our lives. Every once in a while, we're sitting there and you kind of get this click like, what am I doing here? Why are we here? What is the point of all this? And when you start to get those feelings, it can really become overwhelming and dreadful in certain cases. That this more or less is what the painting is depicting. So, in terms of nihilism, and for anyone who's here, feel free to chime in, ask any questions if you want, totally up to you. I found a number of different definitions for nihilism, and I'm interested to see what other people think about this. But nihilism seems to fall into a similar category as free will or other types of discussions where there's a bit of obscurity in terms of definition. I went and looked at a number of different definitions for nihilism for this live stream, and and I could not find any two that agreed. If anything, I could find that every single person disagreed with the other person about what the definition of nihilism is. And as we talk about later, when we get into solutions, this is quite telling in terms of why nihilism is so difficult to navigate, not only in terms of mental health, but also in terms of psychological suffering, mental disorders, and existentially surviving this life. As we'll talk about a little bit later, we know that from neuropsychological sciences that there are certain ways of viewing reality that are more biased in terms of one hemisphere or the other, or certain brain networks. And what we'll see is that these highly intellectualized positions, they're very narrow in focus. And you will see this with people who are very nihilistic. I can speak from experience here because whenever I was working as a therapist, I met quite a few people, especially in military settings, who developed quite a nihilistic perspective of reality. I'm not going to go into too much for specifics because I don't want to give any people away here, but certain people I worked with, they had to make decisions that related to whether some people were going to live or die. And as you can imagine, having to do that over and over again, it really wears on you in terms of how you feel and how you perceive reality. So we'll return to this part for the solutions piece, but right now I just want to convey nihilism is a very highly intellectualized position. It's a very philosophical position. Sometimes reality versus what we perceive in terms of the intellect, those can vary quite a bit. But anyways, let's start with some definitions. I'll get into my case example, and then we'll go through solutions. Okay, so just some quick definitions I pulled from the internet. Some of these I asked AI, some of these I looked into Reddit, some of these were just Google searches. You could probably find them yourself, nothing special here. Nihilism refers to a pervasive sense of meaninglessness, hopelessness, and existential distress, often manifesting as a crisis of meaning in conditions such as depression, schizophrenia, and terminal illness. Nietzsche is a good example here, right? He went through so much suffering in his life. He had so many difficult medical conditions, psychological conditions. And I promise I'm not going to make this discussion entirely about Nietzsche. Actually, what I want to do is I want to help people who are struggling with nihilism take a broader perspective, right? If we try to battle nihilism with an intellectualized approach, it's kind of like fighting fire with fire, so to speak. If we can take a broader view and see beyond the boundaries of what nihilism entails, that can help us find freedom from psychological suffering that comes from nihilism. I'll return to that later on. I promise I will. Just want to emphasize I'm not going to try to push intellectualized positions to challenge or defeat nihilism here. I'm encouraging a different approach. If you want to find more intellectualized approaches, there's tons of people out there. Jordan Peterson, a lot of different channels. I think it's helpful to an extent. It's kind of like food for thought. But if you really want to overcome nihilism, I think it involves a shift in how you perceive reality. That is where the source of suffering comes from with nihilism. It's a worldview that is not conducive to psychological health. And again, we will go over this in just a little bit. Okay, so that's one definition here: meaninglessness, hopelessness, and existential distress. So again, you may agree or disagree with this definition of nihilism. I'm going to give a few here, and then you can formulate your own definition. Or if you disagree with mine and you have your own, feel free to post that as a comment. Okay, the rejection of all religious and moral principles in the belief that life is meaningless. So again, we could probably have a 10-hour discussion here on morals, principles, religious aspects. Are these just created by us? Are these fundamental things? Is it some mixture of the two? More or less, that's what we're getting at here with this definition of nihilism, right? So if we're looking at religious and moral principles, they might say something like, well, those are all man-made constructs. They're social constructs. We created those. They don't really have any true meaning. Okay, so we'll deal with that a little bit later as well. Nihilism is a philosophy asserting that life is without objective meaning, purpose, or intrinsic value. Pay very close attention here to the word objective. Okay. For people who have seen my other videos, they will know that I talk about conventional, objective, and ultimate reality in terms of how to understand what we are, who we are, and how existence pans out. Conventional reality refers to reality as it has been constructed by our psychological functions. So if somebody's argument through nihilism was moral principles are man-made based on our intellect, that would be within conventional reality, right? Objective reality refers to reality as it exists independent of our psychological functions. When we think about physics, quantum studies, or quantum mechanics, how reality can operate independent of whether there's an observer or not. Those are the kinds of things we're talking about with objective reality, right? Reality will do its thing regardless of whether there's a psychological observer or not. Again, a lot of intellectual discussion to be had there, which we will not get into here. And then ultimate reality is the true and truest reality that we can not think of, but we cannot think of when we negate everything that falls into conventional and objective realities. When we negate both of those, what is it that remains? That's what we're looking at for ultimate reality. Ultimate is not some fancy mystical term. Ultimate, quite literally, in the sense of last or final reality, right? That which we can take nothing else from in terms of negation. That's what remains for reality. And again, we will return to that later on as well. Okay, and then I just had to put this in. I thought it was funny. This is directly from a Reddit post. I forget which thread it is, but I think it was on nihilism or absurdism, one of the two. And I'm not going to read this through. If you want to, you can. You can scroll back, look a little bit later. But basically, the takeaway here is that someone was arguing nihilism is a belief or moral framework that essentially states blah, blah, blah. And then there's another comment. Right. So first off, this person is disagreeing with the original poster about what nihilism means and what Nietzsche was talking about. And then the second post here is about, okay, well, nihilism is a different definition than what you've given. So we have three people, three different definitions. Again, that might give us a hint at what is going on here in terms of why people get so stuck with their verbal definitions of nihilism and these worldviews that are generated by the intellect. Spoiler here. And again, if you've seen my other videos, you know this very well. If you have any interest in reading my book when it comes out, you will get to know this very well. Also, the intellect, verbal reasoning, language functions, breaking down reality into thoughts, words, things that we can convey with each other. Very cool ability, very unique ability that we have as humans, but it comes at the cost of reducing reality into simplified world views. Nihilism is no exception here. Once you realize this, it kind of breaks the foundation for nihilism. Once you see that this is also a worldview, the absence of worldviews, claiming you don't have a worldview where everything is nothing, that is a worldview as well, right? Every worldview is meaningless. That's a worldview as well. So, this is something that we do in therapy as well. I'm going to talk about my case example here shortly, but that's something that we really try to address regardless of the theoretical orientation or psychotherapeutic stance we take. In other words, cognitive behavioral therapy, psychodynamic therapies, acceptance and commitment therapies, existential therapies. There's some key mechanisms that play there for psychological change. Okay, so yeah, takeaway here. Lots of different definitions. Nihilism is a highly intellectualized position, lots of variability in terms of what people believe, and kind of like free will, you'll see hours and hours and hours of discussion, debate, arguments, heated discussions about what free will entails. But if we just knew how to define something from the very beginning, it would probably mitigate all of this debate and discussion. I sometimes wonder if people know this deep down, but it gets views and so on. So that's why people do it. My focus here is not on intellectualized discussion. My focus here is on reducing psychological suffering. And I can speak very clearly again in seeing that nihilism contributes to psychological suffering. Okay, so basic picture here to depict basically everything we've talked about, nihilism. And I should have said this at the beginning, nihilism is not necessarily a negative. It has a very negative connotation, but it's not necessarily negative. Nihilism is a view. It tends to be associated with negative views of reality, but it's kind of negative in the sense that you are negating things, not negative in the sense that it's like depression, anxiety, or things that are commonly construed as like difficult, or it's hard to think of another word than negative here, but I think you get what I'm saying. In other words, I don't want to shoot nihilism down and say this is just some, view that we need to toss aside because it's useless. I want to take nihilism seriously here because nihilism actually has some useful components within it. And in terms of the psychology of awakening and the steps you take, the insights you gather about reality, nihilism actually functions as a component for a little while. Until you learn to see past nihilism, you get stuck in it. And once you're stuck in nihilism, it seems valid in that worldview. And again, when we talk about insights, we're talking about broad picture representations of how we understand things in the first place, right? So if you're stuck in this worldview and it's kind of like, can't get my hands oriented, but a little circle there, and you are navigating within that little circle, it's difficult to see things from another perspective. When we talk about insights, now we're looking outside this circle, right? We're going beyond the boundaries of what we previously thought. This is exactly what we have to do to overcome nihilism. You need to see beyond the boundaries of what you are stuck in. But this is very difficult to do for people who are stuck in intellectualized positions because all they can see is the intellect. When you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When you have an intellect, everything looks like a philosophical problem, a theoretical problem, a verbal-based problem, a language-based problem, and that's how you need to contend. But we know from literature and direct experience, there are different and broader ways of thinking about information that are not dependent on these intellectualized verbal functions. And we need these to overcome the challenges that come with nihilism. Okay, so let me spend some time here on my case example. And to be totally honest, this is actually the reason I decided to choose this topic for this week's live stream. I had a specific case back when I was doing therapy. This was several years ago now, and it was just a very memorable case for anyone who's done therapy, or even if you've tried to help someone through mental health difficulties. You will meet someone every once in a while who really makes you think in certain ways, and they really question how well you can do your job here in terms of helping other people and helping them find solutions to their own problems. This is one of those cases for me. So I first met this guy. I'm not going to give specific demographics here for obvious reasons, but I first met this guy when I was seeing patients at a certain hospital and I was taking call. So, call in this sense, people typically think of call with like surgeons or uh, emergency room physicians or whatever it is, but mental health providers take call as well in certain cases. And as you can imagine, oftentimes the calls have to do with suicidal or homicidal ideations, wanting to seriously hurt yourself or wanting to seriously hurt other people. Now, in this case, the individual I saw, I don't remember the exact date, but I'm pretty sure it was probably in the middle of a winter storm at 3 a.m. That's how calls tend to go. Yeah, the fun of taking call there. But, anyways, he was having thoughts of wanting to kill himself. I believe it was a little further than that, actually. He had actually made an attempt to kill himself. And you don't really know anything about the guy. You don't really know anything about the person when you have to take these kinds of calls. I mean, you have records, you can see things in the background, but truthfully and honestly, you're kind of going in based on other people's accounts. And let me tell you, when you hear the call from the attending physician or PA or whoever it is, and they give you the information, it oftentimes is a very small sliver, if not completely inaccurate, in terms of what the person is actually doing, thinking, and feeling. That's precisely why they have behavioral health go in, because behavioral health can take the time, really talk to the person, figure out how to triage the person, and go from there. And that was the case with this individual. I was basically called and I was told that someone had me try to remember here. This person had basically rolled down a very large hill, and this place I was in was a very mountainous and hilly area. So they were trying to roll down this hill, like stop, drop, and roll literally. And they were trying to roll onto oncoming traffic because this particular hill, when you got to the base of it, there was a bit of a slope up, not that much, but if you got enough momentum, you could roll up and then basically go on the freeway. There's a loss of control at that point because once you start to roll, it's too fast, it's too slippery. And he was basically trying to kill himself that way. So that's all I was told. I went to go and see the guy. And first things first, oftentimes when you're doing this, you are meeting people at their absolute worst, their absolute lowest in life. And it's very difficult to talk with people in this sense because they're feeling so despondent, they're feeling so negative about their life. And you basically have to go in there and try to talk to them, figure out what's going on. Sometimes they're so happy that they have someone who listens, other times not so much. They feel like they're just going to get locked in a psych ward and they don't really want to talk to you. But, anyways, as I talked to this guy, he had a very strange demeanor. Very strange in the sense that what was going on was he was very neutral, like matter of fact, very detached, so to speak, from everything that was going on. And there's a few types of detachment that you see. This type of detachment was, I'm going to try to phrase this properly here. He was attached to being detached to everything. So just think about that for a second. This is someone who is attached to being detached to everything. So he's basically very stuck with this notion that everything is kind of pointless. Nothing really has meaning. What is the point of all this? Why should I care? I might as well play the stakes and roll with probability. That's basically what he told me for why he attempted in this case. He basically said, well, nothing really matters. I don't really care. Screw the morals, screw what other people think. I'm just going to roll the dice, right? I'm going to roll down the hill. I'm going to leave the probability up to science and physics because those are objective, obviously. And that will determine whether I die or not. So just think about it for yourself for a second here. How would you how would you talk to a person like this? What would you tell them, right? There's so many different areas that we could approach here. And my focus at that point, this is kind of a trap that you can easily get caught in when you're trying to work with someone who has nihilistic tendencies. excuse me, it can be very tempting to engage them intellectually. What do you mean science is objective? Like, what do you mean probability? You're the one who started the event. How could you go through this and that? Those are traps. I can tell you this from therapeutic experience. Those are traps. And this is what they're used to doing. Nihilistic people, I don't want to say nihilistic people, but people with nihilistic views, they tend to be very intelligent, believe it or not. Some people don't think so. In my experience, they are very intelligent people. When you have to break things down logically, put them into patterns and sequences, these people can do it very well. That's precisely how they got to this position in the first place. So I didn't engage him with those things. I was more interested in the context of what he was saying. I wasn't so interested in the content. For anyone who's listening, if you want a nice therapeutic skill, if you want a nice therapeutic skill, learn to listen to the context of what people are saying, not the content. The content is usually, especially for mental health issues, not always, but sometimes for mental health issues, it's kind of a facade. It's an appearance that they're trying to give off. If you can read between the lines, you can see the deeper meaning of what they are trying to get across, right? His content was about logical fixations, a suicide attempt because of the laws of physics, but the context, getting to the point of testing these things out as a suicide attempt, that's pretty serious, right? I mean, if you were truly just interested in the laws of physics, maybe you could have got a bachelor's degree or a doctorate in physics and tested things out that way, right? Why did we turn to a suicide attempt to try to figure this out? So that's what I was trying to probe with him. And it became very obvious very fast that this individual, he was using the intellect and these nihilistic views, he was using it as a front to avoid psychological distress in his life. I'll spoil a little bit here because there's more to this story, because I end up seeing him for a group therapy session, 2-week partial hospitalization program. It's kind of like inpatient, but you get to go home every day. So it's kind of an intermediate thing. But basically, this guy was engaging in all these behaviors because he was sexually abused as a child by his own father for several years. I mean, just imagine being a child and trying to cope with that. Your parental figure, right? The person who's supposed to take care of you, they are sexually abusing you, taking advantage of you, and hurting you in ways that you just can't recover from at the time, right? I mean, some people can, some people don't, but I would say for everybody, that causes a permanent shift in how you view reality and view things. So this poor guy, he was sexually abused by his father. We come to learn later on, he was also sexually abused by his grandfather, both together. So his view of parental figures and support, these things were crushed completely down to dust. And I didn't know that at the time, but basically what was going on with him was that. And we were in the room and I just wanted to probe a little bit, like, how far does this logical thinking go? And his commander was there. This guy was in the military, and his commander was there in the room with me, and we were both trying to talk to him and trying to show that people do really care about him. This is true, right? This is not some fake thing we're telling him. This commander genuinely cared about him. He didn't have to sit in the room and be there with him, but he did. And when we said that to him, you could see it in his eyes, like the shift when someone told him that he was cared for. There was such a deep shift there, and it looked like he was about to cry, but he ended up blocking it with exactly what you would expect. He ended up talking more about intellectualized things. He was like, what do you mean by care? Nobody can care. Care is a made up thing. Care is just something people use to take advantage of other people. Can you see how this falls into that nihilistic narrative that he had? He was compartmentalizing everything into this negative view and using that to feed this nihilistic perspective so that he could continue to believe this worldview. I believe, I never got to truly know for him, but I believe his rationale was, at least if everything is meaningless, then I can avoid suffering in the sense that what happened to me from my father and my grandfather was also meaningless. I never really got to ask him that, but I suspect that's what his perspective was. So, anyways, to not take up too much time here, what we ended up doing was we hospitalized him. And it had to be an involuntary hospitalization, unfortunately, because when you are the provider and you are determining what to do with the patient, you have to be able to safety plan with the person. Are they amenable to a safety plan? Can this person show me and prove to me that they can adhere to safety precautions so that they aren't going to try to take their life again? If they can't do that, then we don't really have a way to guarantee the person's safety. And that was the case with him, right? He was basically telling his commander to F off. He was telling me to F off. He was saying he didn't care. He was saying, if you let me out, I'm going to do it again. I don't care. I'm going to go do it again. I'm going to roll the dice and we'll see what happens, right? Physics, this objective, so-called objective stance will determine whether I live or not. So we didn't really have a choice in that sense. I really did want to help the guy. So what I did was I had to involuntarily hospitalize him, but I also did my best because I was in the mental health clinic as well. I did my best to make sure he would be sent to a partial hospitalization program. We don't want to just hospitalize people and then leave them alone. I want this guy to get therapy. I want this guy to get help. I could tell from that one question I asked him, or that one comment I made about caring for him, that there was some deep, deep pain there. And this nihilism perspective, this worldview, this was a cover for this deep pain that he was experiencing. So, again, just another brief takeaway here. If you are dealing with nihilism yourself, or if you are dealing with other people who have nihilism, see if you can figure out what the root cause is. And this is exactly what I talk about with the psychology of awakening. All psychological suffering has causes. If you know these causes, you start to know the solution in terms of removing those causes. It's a very logical analysis here, right? And it happens to work. If you know the causes for psychological suffering and you remove those causes, you have removed what can lead to psychological suffering. How can you suffer if there's no causes there, right? Oftentimes with nihilism, you will see this to be the case. I won't talk about other case examples here. I want to finish up with this one. But other individuals I have met who have had nihilistic perspectives, they're often afflicted with terminal illnesses or severe mental health illnesses like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, autism spectrum disorder in some cases. Can you really blame them? I mean, yeah, we're talking about how to deal with nihilism here, but can you also understand that people are just trying to navigate this life the best way they can? Imagine, maybe some of my audience is like this. I don't know, but imagine you're born with a condition that you can't really do anything about, right? Autism, for example, and autism can be positive in some cases. Let me make that clear. But for people I have seen, some of them, they really are unhappy with their autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. Other people are more accepting, but you can't really do anything about it, right? Your brain, as far as literature goes, your brain is physically wired differently. It's not necessarily better, it's not necessarily worse, but for certain people, they take it negatively because they think, why am I so different from everybody else? Why was I given this? Why did this happen to me? Why not somebody else? And that, as you can imagine, creates a very negative spiral in terms of how the world is viewed. So nihilism here is very relevant to mental health in this sense. Anyways, I ended up hospitalizing the guy. I only got to see him that one time because that was a triage capacity, not a therapy capacity. He ends up getting hospitalized, and I'm able to hear some things about him. And basically what ends up happening is that he doesn't go through with the partial hospitalization program. He does everything in his power to decline it. He fights his commander. He fights everybody in the chain of command. That just means people who are superior to him in terms of rank and authority and whatnot. And he wins. He's able to get out of the partial hospitalization program. In the military, it's a little different in the sense that you give up certain rights to be active duty. And one of the things they can do is they can compel certain types of mental health treatment on you if you're an active duty service member, because the core criteria for being a service member is that you are operationally ready, right? You can deploy at any time. They need you to meet the requirements of the mission. That's the whole point of being active duty. So this guy, and again, remember, he's really smart, right? He knows how to use his intellect. I suspect he tricked his commander. I suspect he tricked his chain of command, and he made them believe that he wouldn't attempt again. He made them believe that he was going to change his ways and everything was going to be all good. Now, people who aren't trained in mental health, they tend to fall for these things. I mean, we know that one of the highest risk factors for suicide is not only a prior attempt, but also a prior hospitalization. When you hospitalize somebody, they are in a very vulnerable state. And psychiatry's goal is to stabilize the person. Their goal is to stabilize them in such a way that they can basically rehabilitate and get back into society and what they're doing, and they're just fine. But certain people, they take hospitalization as a punishment, right? So what they do is they try to trick the system so they don't have to go back, and they'll lie, basically. And that was the case with this guy. So that happens, and I'm obviously still thinking about this guy. I mean, I did see a lot of people in my time with call and such, but this was one of those people where, yeah, again, if you've had this experience, I don't really wish it on anybody, but when you work with some of these people, you really wonder when you go back home at night, is this person going to be alive tomorrow? You really wonder that. And you wonder if you did your best in terms of deciding correctly what should have been done with this person. Because it goes both ways, right? If you think you're going to get away with hospitalizing everybody, not necessarily the case. If you approach the situation wrong, people can just go through with the hospitalization, they'll lie, and then they just go home and try to kill themselves again. Now, this guy, he was particularly difficult because I don't think it would have mattered whichever way we went, because the root cause for his suffering could not be addressed by medications and a brief stay in inpatient psychiatry. That was the fundamental problem. So what happened was he tricks command, he gets out. We don't really hear about the guy for a few months. I'm not sure why. I suspect he was still attempting, but he wasn't really caught. But eventually he gets caught again. And maybe caught isn't the right word, but they find out that he's trying to kill himself again. And he's doing the exact same thing. He's going back to this hill, he's rolling down, and he's trying to see if physics is going to kill him or not. Now, one other perspective here is that, just like what I was talking about before, this notion of nihilism is a cover up for deeper suffering. And I wonder too if that was the case for him. I actually found out this was the case. He was able to open up a little bit later, which again I'm going to get into here shortly. These things were basically a cry for help. And for those who don't know, a cry for help refers to people who are asking for assistance, but they don't really know how to do it in an effective way. For example, with nihilism, that would mean crushing his own worldview, right? If everything's meaningless, why go for help? And he didn't really know how to ask for help in that sense. So you could imagine that these repeated suicide attempts, if this was really just about testing physics and probability here, why are we having to do this for months and months on end, right? In my opinion, this was a cry for help from him. This is the way that he was trying to get help. He didn't really know how to do it. You could take that probabilities approach and apply it to receiving mental health as well. I suppose you could think of it that way. So anyways, a few months go by, he attempts, and then he comes back. And I am not the one to see him on call the second time. Wait, actually I am. I take that back. I just happened to be, and this is months later, right? We're rotating between dozens of providers in some cases for mental health on call. This was the one. I remember it now. I happened to be on call that second time that he was. It's a really low probability, but it's pretty crazy. And he remembered me from the first time. I was expecting him to be really angry with me, but he wasn't. And it was just really strange. Like, I was expecting him to say, like, why did you put me through hospitalization? He's going to cuss me out or something. But he didn't. He was actually very different this time. And he actually broke down in tears several times. I was able to get through to him a little bit, and he acknowledged that he needed help. So this time, we made an agreement to put him through the partial hospitalization program. And I was able to get command on board with this to ensure that he would be going. We have something called first sergeants in the military. There might be different names for different branches, but basically these are very honorable people, by the way. These are people who basically step up beyond their original duties and agree to do additional things to take care of members in their own units. So first sergeant would make sure every day, he would make sure that this guy was going to his appointment, was coming back, and there'd be check-ins every few hours or whatever it was to make sure he was safe. He was on what we call the high interest log, right? People who have attempted or meet certain criteria, we need to watch them carefully to make sure they don't actually kill themselves. So he ends up coming through our partial hospitalization program. I am also running the program at this time. And basically, it's a 2-week program, and you have a bunch of different modalities for psychotherapies. I believe there's art therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy. I think there was certain type of dog therapy as well. We had a dog come through, and never underestimate how much petting a dog can help somebody with their mental health. But anyways, we had those groups, and he was also in the group as well. So now we're dealing with multiple roles here, right? I saw him as the triage provider. Now I'm seeing him in more or less a therapeutic capacity, and there's other people in this group as well. And fortunately, it was a good group. Sometimes you get really tough groups, especially people who have personality disorders. Not bashing on them, but it does add a degree of complexity with the group. That didn't happen in this case. If anything, this guy was perhaps the one who may have had certain personality features. But anyways, other people in the group started to see issues with his worldview. They started to see how his worldview, this nihilism, was contributing to his psychological suffering. And we obviously don't pick on anybody in the group individually, but everyone is kind of fair game in terms of people asking questions for other people. And it was a really good group, fortunately. Lots of people said that they cared about him. And I believe they did. I genuinely do, because your units are pretty small and pretty tightly packed. And they were able to give him a sense of compassion and empathy that I think he's never had before, right? This is coming from someone who was sexually abused from his father and grandfather for years. And just imagine perhaps hearing that for the first time, right? Even in the military, when you get in there, it's changing now for the better, but yeah, depending on what unit you're in, compassion's not necessarily in the forefront of what you're doing, right? The certain unit might emphasize your operational duties more than anything else. So that really made an impact for him. I remember this was a little more than halfway into the group, and we were doing a portion of acceptance and commitment therapy where we started to talk about values. Values in acceptance and commitment therapy are meaningful life directions, right? What is it you want to do that gives your life a sense of purpose? And this was excellent groundwork for nihilistic attacks, as you can imagine. Excuse me. As you can imagine, in a number of different fronts, values are morally constructed, right? If I scroll back here, values don't have any true meaning. Values are, they're just made up by people in certain ways, blah blah blah, and so on. So other group members, I didn't do this. I'm just, in my opinion, if you are running a group well as the therapist or provider, you don't really have to talk that much. You are kind of like a proctor more than anything else. A well-run group is individuals within the group talking amongst each other more so than you talking at these individuals. So I'm able to take a back seat, but obviously I'm still proctoring a little bit. And other members of the group were quite keen on these nihilistic arguments. I think they had enough of his views a little bit, because they started to really not grill him, but they were questioning him on his views, right? It's like, okay, well, if you're so nihilistic and if nothing has meaning, then why is it that you are adhering so much to science? Like, why is that a true logical system that has a meaning but nothing else does? Why aren't you applying the same nihilistic scrutiny to science? if you don't think values have any meaning, why do you value nihilism, right? And these kinds of arguments were coming up back and forth, and he was logically pushing all of them aside. And then one person in the group eventually said, and I don't remember this word for word, but one person in the group eventually said, it's like, I understand you have a logical answer for everything, but I know you're hurting deep down inside. And I care about you. All of us care about you. And we just really want to know what it is that's hurting you so much. It was something like that. It was just so empathetic and compassionate. I was really impressed by what that person said. And he just broke down in tears, like not sobbing, not just a couple tears. He like broke down crying for several minutes. And everyone in the group knew exactly what to do. Fortunately, they stayed quiet. They let him work through the emotions, perhaps for the first time in his life, or maybe the first time in the past few years. They let him work through those things. And for the first time, we actually heard something else other than nihilism from this guy. And we we heard him say that this is the first time he's ever felt loved in his life, cared for. That was so deep for this guy, right? It was so deep for everyone else in the group. It's just, wow. I think we finally kind of broken this nihilistic view at least one of the seams, right? That's not something that somebody with a nihilistic view would say, right? They wouldn't say something like that. They would say something else like, love, compassion, all these things are kind of meaningless. So that little crack, that's all it takes to break the entire foundation, right? It's just like a piece of concrete. It's really strong, but once you see that first crack, it's only a matter of time, right? The crack spreads, even if it's a thin hairline crack. And that was the start of breaking down that worldview for him. Now, I wish this was a totally happy ending story. Maybe it is. I don't know, because we finished up with the partial hospitalization group, and I never heard from the guy again. So I don't really know what happened to him. I was able to trace his records every once in a while, and I did see that he had follow-ups for the next few years, the time that I was still at that particular place. So I know he was alive, but I don't know beyond that. But I can say, just even from breaking that little piece there, I know from a therapy basis, that is all it takes. Once you start to make that shift and you help someone see beyond what the original scope of the problem is, that's where the change really starts to take place. So let's go on to some solutions here for nihilism. This is perhaps why people are here. And if that is the case, I apologize, because I took almost 43 minutes to get to them, but I did try to piece some things in there. So with nihilism, there are several different things that we need to address. The first, and I mentioned this before, if you have seen my other videos, you understand the limitations of views. Views of every single kind are based in our psychological functions. Our psychological functions are impermanent and take a small sliver of objective reality and parse that into something we can work with. So in this sense, they are correct, right? But instead of saying things are impermanent, they jump to saying everything is nothing. Do you see the difference there? It's kind of like the argument of someone saying a soul is impermanent, like it doesn't have a permanent essence, versus saying there is no soul at all. Or perhaps saying that about a self, right? If you're telling someone they don't have a sense of self, they're going to look at you like you're a moron, right? Because clearly they feel phenomenologically that they have a sense of self. So again, the wording really matters here. Now, this is my opinion, and other people will make do with what they want here. I don't think taking an intellectual stance against nihilism is the best approach. And the reason for that comes down to not only neurobiology, but my own experience here. When you take an intellectual approach and you try to push it against nihilism, it's going to get absorbed within that nihilistic capacity. Again, these are very logical and very smart people. They know how to take the hammer of nihilism and crush any type of opposing intellectualized perspective. I think the better approach is to help them see beyond the scope of the problem, right? You can have something that is internally consistent and internally true, but it is not holistically true or holistically correct. What's a good example of this? In science, when you see a paradigm shift in how something is looked at, that's a perfect example right there, right? Everybody, for example, took classical mechanics in physics to be the end all be all explanation for objective reality. When you start to go smaller and smaller, classical mechanics, Newtonian mechanics, it breaks down. It doesn't accurately predict what happens. So now we need a new paradigm, quantum mechanics, to explain things. Similar thing here with nihilism. Instead of trying to combat things intellectually, try to help them see from a broader perspective what it is that is going on. Now, one of my favorite examples, and I'm going to make videos on this later on when I get more into the experiential side of the psychology of awakening, in other words, actual practices. One of my favorite practices are the jhanas. And for people who haven't heard of these jhanas before, there's a whole mystical side to these things as well, supernatural powers. I don't really buy into those things for a number of reasons, but in terms of what you can validate and experientially prove for yourself, these jhanas, they are states of meditation that involve altered states of consciousness, in other words, changing the contents and states of your experience. And they give you a number of important insights. I'm not going to go in depth here about jhanas, but the part I want to get across is this. The first few stages of the jhanas are very focused on the material view of things. And then eventually, as you get more insights, you start to see that the material things are impermanent and everything that is material is bounded by consciousness, right? These are some of the arguments you see today, right? Anything that you can think of in physics, or this computer in front of me, this microphone, these are all within the context of my awareness and my conscious experience. They are contents of my consciousness, but not consciousness itself. So you start to get insights into that. But then you get an insight also that consciousness is within nothing, right? Nothingness, as they say in these jhana practices. And you could argue this is where the nihilistic stance comes in, right? Material, consciousness, space, all these things, they fall within this category of nothingness. Now, in the past, that was kind of the end point for these jhana practices. It's like, well, how do you go beyond nothing, right? What goes on after nothing? That's exactly where the nihilistic perspective is, right? What do you tell somebody who says that nothingness is the end all be all? Well, there is a step further you can go, and this is what you practice in the eighth jhana. You find that material, consciousness, awareness, and nothingness are all encapsulated by perception, right? To say that everything is nothing is still within the context of your own perception. That is a really important insight because it helps you see that nihilism is also another worldview, right? You start to see beyond this small cluster of what nihilism is in terms of a conceptual category. And then you start to enter this base called the base of neither perception nor non-perception. If you haven't heard of that before, or even if you had, just think about that for a second. It sounds absolutely bizarre because it is. But what you find is that reality goes deeper than perception. And you can't say not perception, you can't say perception. It kind of goes a little bit beyond this hard limit of what we can conceptualize as humans, right? We have psychological functions, but they are limited in certain senses. And this, in my opinion, is the most important insight to help deal with nihilism. Once you can see that nihilism also is a worldview that is within your own intellect and psychological functions, and you acknowledge the impermanent, limited nature of all of these things, you lose attachment to nihilism, right? That, in my opinion, is the biggest problem with nihilism. You are attached to being unattached. You are attached to nothingness. They perhaps don't see that because their perspective is everything is nothing, but they don't question the very ground of this worldview that comes up in the first place, right? To say that everything is nothing is also a view, right? So when you say everything is nothing, you haven't taken a step back beyond this perspective in and of itself. Can you see how a nihilistic perspective is also constrained within your own perception and psychological functions? If you can see that, and if you can acknowledge the limitations of your own psychological functions through these practices that lead to awakening and freedom from psychological suffering, that helps you become free from nihilism because you realize any worldview that you attach to, whether it's nihilism, materialism, idealism, whatever it is, they have hard limits in terms of how reality can be conceptualized because reality at its core cannot be conceptualized by us in a positive sense. We know that reality is more fundamental than what we could ever conceptualize because when we rule out everything we could ever conceptualize, reality continues to go on. If you want a simple analogous example here so that I don't sound too specific here, take all the theories we have in physics, okay? Every single type of theory you can think of, quantum field theory, classical mechanics, quantum mechanics. I'm not a physicist, so there's many more. But when you look at the percent of the known universe that physics can explain, it is 5%. 5%. That's just remarkable, right? We know dark matter, dark energy, these constitute 95% of the universe, but we don't have any type of explanation for them. But we do know they exist by basically interactions with this small 5% that we have, but we don't know anything beyond that. In this same way, that is how nihilism operates. It is like the 5% view of reality. But because you're so narrowly focused on this 5% view, you miss out on the other 95% that is going on around you. And this is the next area that we really need to talk about when we're dealing with nihilism: reality versus theory. People who are very caught in the intellect and people who are very attached to the intellect, they fail to see how reality and theory differ. You will see this with many philosophers, right? They will sit there and they will talk to you for 10 hours, 10 days, however long it is. They will talk to you endlessly about their theory and what they have. But does this theory actually hold water? This is why I say it's so important to reality test any type of perspective, view, or the absence of views, whatever you want to call it. It is so important to reality test these things. If you reality test them and they aren't useful for you, what is the point of attaching to them, right? And I've sat down with people who have had very nihilistic perspectives, and I ask them, "Hey, I get it. It's very logical. Okay, you have an answer for everything, but is it helpful for you?" Right now, we're looking at the context of nihilism as opposed to the content of these logical arguments. Is this nihilistic perspective useful for you? Give me an honest answer. You had a suicide attempt. You tried to kill yourself, right? Is it helping you? And the answer is no, right? Whether you take a nihilistic stance or not, if someone is actively trying to kill themselves multiple times because everything is meaningless, I don't think you could logically say that's a very useful worldview, right? So that again is kind of the way to approach nihilism. We're looking at different areas. We're kind of pressure testing different parts of the foundation for this person's nihilistic views. We're trying to see where there's cracks, weaknesses, so that we can help the person see beyond this type of worldview. I don't want to call it a delusion because that's a very loaded term, but I do want to get this point across. Much of psychotherapy and mental health recovery involves seeing past initial worldviews that we had about things. Post-traumatic stress disorder, in my opinion, is the easiest and best example to understand for this. A serious, and hey, for the guy I talked about with the case, you could argue the exact same thing, right? This could be a form of post-traumatic stress disorder. Being sexually abused by your father and your grandfather for years on end, imagine what that does to you, right? Avoidance, nihilism, right? That shows significant overlap here. So post-traumatic stress disorder, basically what happens mechanistically and on the psychological level is that you go through an experience that is so severe and so painful that you don't know how to deal with it. So you avoid it in whatever way you can. Short-term strategies, hey, I'll take it. I'll drink alcohol. I'll basically develop a nihilistic perspective. I will do drugs. I will go live in the cabin in the middle of nowhere, isolate from people. Short-term solutions, and you can't blame them because that's the best they know, right? They're trying to deal with this suffering as much as they can. So same idea there, right? It's helping people see past this perspective that they had and this limiter that they had. You can't just tell them, right? You can't just say, "Hey, your perspective doesn't work." They know that logically, but to experientially realize and understand through insight and a deeper basis, that's where the real recovery comes in. So trying to help people who have nihilistic perspectives see past this initial view instead of trying to argue within that nihilistic view, I think that's a better way to deal with this challenge. And by the way, I want to make this clear. This is a difficult position to contend with, right? And it's difficult because nihilistic perspectives do have certain truths to them, right? When we talk about the impermanence of things, yeah, it makes sense in that way. Okay, let me see if there's anything else I want to talk about here. Yeah, the last piece, I'll just touch on this a little bit more. And again, if you've seen my other videos, when we use language functions, again, language by definition, symbols to re-represent reality in ways that are easier understood and easier to manipulate. Hi, whoever made that comment. Thanks for your comment. Hi from Ohio. Yeah, so that is basically, in a nutshell, what we can do about nihilism. Does anyone else have any other approaches? Has anything else worked for anyone? I'm super curious to hear about it. And whatever therapy you go through or deal with, it's going to mechanistically kind of be at the same point, right? We're going to be looking at worldviews, cognitive restructuring if it's CBT. And in my opinion, if you're looking at more of a third wave, cognitive behavioral therapy, it's going to be more about the context and the relationship someone has. We could argue that, hey, nihilism itself is not a problem. It's the relationship you have to nihilism that is a problem, right? Having the view that nothing has any true meaning. I know people who have that view and they're totally fine. They realize it's a view. But once you buy into it and it shapes your perception in such a way that you end up with psychological suffering, yeah, that's a different story, right? Then we need to look more into psychological and therapeutic strategies. And again, this all comes down to what it is you want to do and what it is you want to achieve. We could sit here and say, well, having certain types of nihilistic perspectives help Nietzsche write tons of books, right? In that sense, nihilism could be useful. It's not an entirely useless thing. It's more so about what you do with the understanding and relationship you have with your own views and your own psychological faculties. So in that sense, we don't want to just judge people immediately and it's like, oh, he said everything's meaningless. Well, this guy's a total, nihilistic loser and I don't want to talk to him. Not necessarily the case, right? You can learn things from everybody. Everyone has interesting things to share. You just have to listen. And if you know how to listen properly, you help people who are talking to you listen to themselves as well. That's another very important ability you can have as a therapist. You kind of, I don't want to say a mirror, but you become kind of a conduit to help someone understand themselves a little bit better through you. They start to see themselves and who they are and who they think they are through you. But if you're sitting there and telling them what to think and how to feel and trying to solve their problems, I don't think that's effective therapy. Effective therapy is helping somebody navigate their problems on their own. Someone who can solve their own problems. I mean, other therapists are going to say different things here, but I think most of the good therapists, they don't want to see their patients forever, right? If they want to collect a paycheck, fine. But if you genuinely want to help people, you want them to be able to solve their own issues on their own. And when they can do this, especially that guy, the case study I talked about, I hope he's still working on those different areas. We showed him how these different perspectives can crack a worldview, even one that is as strong as nihilism. So I really hope he's still doing his thing and functioning better, but I haven't heard any updates. So I'll go ahead and leave things there. Does anyone have any questions for me? Anything I can answer? It doesn't have to be related to the topic here. I'm really happy to answer anything that you guys might have. And if you don't, that's totally fine. No pressure. I'll give it a few seconds here. And if not, then and wrap things up. So any questions? We'll give it a few more seconds. What's my background? Like professional credentials? I am a psychologist. I do clinical and forensic work together. Right now, I'm primarily working in forensic arenas, criminal cases, competency, sanity evaluations. I am planning on doing therapy as well in the future. I was doing therapy for the past, like 5 years or so. And I really like forensics too. But basically, yeah, absolutely. That video is, I think, really important because, again, it's a similar kind of argument with these views, right? When you have views and you stick onto them, it keeps you from seeing deeper bases of reality and understanding things a little bit more about yourself. When you have views and you stick onto those, it limits you in certain ways. But yeah, absolutely. I do have a book that is coming out, and it's called The Psychology of Awakening. I really go through everything as best as possible to help explain things. But this channel, I primarily made it to help give things for free because I really think people are, I don't want to say conned, but there's a lot of people who are trying to sell products and sell spiritual practices. I truly want to give all these things for free. I want people to benefit, and I want people to help themselves so that they can help others as well. That's truly the goal of what I'm trying to do here. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Appreciate your comment. All right, so I'll go ahead and wrap things up here. If there's any other questions, I'm happy to answer them. I'll wait a few more seconds and then we'll close things out. All right, I don't see anything else, so I will see you all next week. I'm here Fridays, 10 to 11 EST, if you want to come back. Take care. Have a good weekend.